true wisdom is almost always born from the fires of pain and struggle. We share the deep tales of resilience that will inspire your heart and challenge your mind to grow stronger. Hit subscribe now and follow us for your daily inspiration.
She doesn't belong to him. 4 words. My sister-in-law said them quietly into my husband's ear at our gender reveal party, her lips barely moving, her eyes locked on mine across a room full of pink and gold balloons. I watched my husband's face shift, confusion folding into something darker, and I felt the familiar weight of the folder tucked inside my bag pressing against my hip. I had been waiting 3 months for this moment. I smiled. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to thank everyone who has joined our community here at the Masked Connections. If you believe that truth, however painful, is always worth uncovering, please subscribe. It's free, and today's story is about what happens when the person trying to destroy your family has been sleeping under the same roof as yours. My name is Rachel. I am 37 years old, I am an architect, and 8 months ago I was standing in the sunlit living room of our home in Lincoln Park, Chicago, surrounded by the closest people in our lives, watching pink powder burst from a balloon my husband Nathan popped with a single pin. We were having a daughter. Nathan cried. His mother cried. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth and laughed at the same time. It was the most perfect moment of my life. Right up until the moment my sister-in-law Sophie walked through our front door 40 minutes late, with an envelope in her hand and ruin in her eyes. I should tell you about Sophie. She and Nathan's older brother Ethan had been married for 4 years. Though the word married in their case had always felt like a diplomatic term for 2 people sharing an address and a mutual agreement not to look too closely at each other's lives. Sophie was a corporate litigator. She was precise the way a surgical blade is precise, useful in the right circumstances, dangerous in every other. She had never liked me. I had always told myself it was professional jealousy, that watching Nathan and me build something solid and warm made her uncomfortable because it reflected what was missing in her own marriage. I had been half right about that. The part I had wrong was considerably more complicated. When Sophie walked into our living room, the pink powder was still settling in the air. She set her bag on the entryway table with a careful, deliberate click. She crossed the room in that measured way of hers, the way she probably crossed a courtroom, and she leaned close to Nathan's ear. I was 12 feet away. I could not hear the words, but I could read the intention in every line of her body. When she pulled back, Nathan was holding a small white envelope she had pressed into his palm. He looked at it. He looked at me. I walked over calmly, set my hand on his arm, and said to Sophie in a voice that did not waver, "You are welcome to stay, but I think you should know that I already know what's in that envelope." Sophie's chin lifted. The room had gone very quiet. She said, "Then you know that child isn't his." And I said, "No. I know you believe that. There's a difference. I would like to take you back to 8 months earlier, because the truth doesn't start at a party. It starts with something much smaller. It started with a photograph. Nathan and I had been trying for 2 years when I finally got pregnant. 2 years of early mornings and clinical appointments and the particular grief of negative tests, which is a grief that nobody talks about enough. When the line finally appeared, I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes, holding the test with both hands as if it might change its mind. We told our families at Christmas. Nathan's parents, his father Robert, a retired federal judge, and his mother Catherine, who ran a nonprofit arts foundation on Michigan Avenue, received the news with the warmth I had always loved about them. Ethan shook Nathan's hand. Sophie smiled with her mouth. The photograph was on Ethan's phone. I want to be clear about how I came to see it, because context matters and I am not someone who goes through other people's things. We were at Robert and Catherine's home for a Sunday dinner in January. Ethan had set his phone on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl while he helped his father carry dishes from the dining room. The screen lit up with a notification. I wasn't looking for anything, but the preview showed a name I had never seen, and 3 words of a message that stopped me mid-reach for a glass of water. "She needs more." I did not touch the phone. I memorized the name, Dana Whitfield. And then I went back to the dinner table and ate my lamb chop and said nothing to anyone. That night I told myself it was nothing. A client, probably. A colleague. Ethan ran a commercial real estate firm. There were 100 legitimate explanations. But I am an architect. My entire professional life is built on the understanding that structure reveals intent, that the way something is built tells you everything about why it was built. I could not stop thinking about those 3 words. She needs more. Not she is asking for more. Not the project needs more. She. Specifically, she. And more of what? I did something I am not proud of, and I will tell you plainly what it was. I looked up Dana Whitfield on LinkedIn, on public property records, on the Cook County Court database, which is publicly accessible. What I found in 45 minutes of searching on a Tuesday evening while Nathan watched basketball in the other room was this. Dana Whitfield, age 29, lived in a rental apartment in Wicker Park. The apartment had been leased, according to public records, under a corporate LLC. The LLC, when I traced it through the Illinois Secretary of State's business registry, listed Ethan's firm as its registered agent. Ethan was paying Dana Whitfield's rent. I sat with that for 2 weeks. I told myself it was still explainable. A sublease arrangement. Maybe. A business favor. I was 8 weeks pregnant and tired, and I genuinely did not want to find what I was beginning to suspect I was going to find. But the thought kept returning, patient and persistent as water finding cracks in a foundation. If this is nothing, why does it feel like something? In February, I called an old colleague from my firm, a woman named Marlene who had left architecture to run a private investigations practice that specialized in financial forensics. I had sent her a referral 2 years earlier that had become her largest client. She owed me a favor and she said so without me having to ask. I told her what I needed. I told her I needed to know who Dana Whitfield was to Ethan, and I told her I needed to know quietly, because Nathan's family was the kind of family where rumor caused as much damage as fact. Marlene came back to me in 3 weeks. She sat across from me at a corner table in a coffee shop in River North, and she put a folder on the table between us, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "There's a child. Dana Whitfield has a daughter. She is 3 years old. Her name is Mia." And based on the financial pattern Marlene had traced monthly transfers from a personal account connected to Ethan's firm, private preschool tuition, pediatric appointments billed to an insurance policy with Ethan's name on it. Ethan was her father. I drove home in silence. I parked in our garage and sat in the car for a long time. I want to tell you what I was feeling, because it was not what you might expect. I was not devastated in the way I had been afraid I would be. I was something colder and more focused than devastation. I was thinking about Sophie. Because if Ethan had a child, he had been hiding a child who was now 3 years old, which meant this had been going on since before Nathan and I were even engaged. Then Sophie either knew, or she had been deceived for 3 years, or she had known, and had chosen silence, because silence served her somehow. I needed to know which one. I also needed to know what this had to do with the envelope she would eventually bring to my gender reveal party. That connection took another 6 weeks to uncover, and it required me to do something I had been reluctant to do. Go through the documents in Nathan's home office. I had access to Nathan's office. This was my home. I am not going to apologize for what I looked at. What I found, buried in a filing folder marked Ethan Misk, was a printed email chain dated 14 months earlier. The chain was between Sophie and Nathan. In it, Sophie told Nathan that she had reason to believe the baby I was carrying we had been trying for so long by then, she would have known before I announced it publicly might not be his. She did not say why she believed this. She offered no evidence. She simply planted the idea, in writing, in an email to my husband, and then asked him to keep it between the two of them until she could gather more information. Nathan had written back 2 words. Got it. I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where I had found it. I went to the kitchen and I made myself a cup of tea, and I stood at the window looking out at the February snow on our back deck for a long time. Then I called Marlene again. What I needed to understand was why Sophie had written that email. What did she gain from making Nathan doubt me? I had been faithful to my husband for every day of our 8 years together. The suggestion was absurd on its face. But Sophie was a litigator. She did not make moves without purpose. If she was planting doubt about my baby's paternity, she was doing it to serve an objective. What was the objective? Marlene answered that question in the way she answered most questions. By following the money. The Calloway family trust Robert and Catherine's estate, accumulated over 40 years of Robert's legal career, was structured to pass to Nathan and Ethan in equal shares upon Robert's death, with provisions for legitimate grandchildren. Robert was 71 and had been managing a heart condition for 3 years. The trust was not hypothetical. It was imminent. And here was the thing Marlene found buried in an amendment filed 18 months ago. A clause, added by a junior attorney at the family's estate firm, that allowed for challenge of beneficiary status on the basis of paternity. The clause was unusual. The attorney who had drafted it had left the firm 9 months later under quiet circumstances. The partner who had approved it was a woman named Henderson who, when Marlene dug further, had overlapping social connections with Sophie through a Chicago Bar Association committee they both served on. Sophie had not planted that clause herself. The paper trail was too careful for a direct connection, but someone had planted it, and the person with the most to gain from a paternity challenge against Nathan's child was the woman married to the other heir. If my baby was ruled not to be Nathan's, under that clause's interpretation, she would not qualify for the grandchildren's provision of the trust. Ethan and Dana's daughter Mia, whose existence was currently hidden, would be the only qualifying grandchild. All of the grandchildren's provision would flow to her. And to Ethan, and by extension, to Sophie, as long as their marriage held. It was, I will give her this, elegant in its ugliness. I spent the next 3 weeks building my response, the way I build a structure. From the foundation up, checking every joint, testing every load, bearing element before adding the next layer. Marlene obtained a certified DNA test conducted by an independent lab in Indianapolis, using samples collected under documented chain of custody procedures. I want to be specific about this because the question of how prenatal paternity testing works is a fair one, and the answer is that it can be done legally and reliably through non-invasive methods as early as 7 weeks. I was careful. I was thorough. The results confirmed what I had known in my bones from the beginning: my daughter was Nathan's. I also obtained, through Marlene's contacts at the Cook County Recorder's Office, a certified documentation of Mia Whitfield's birth certificate which listed the father as unknown alongside the financial records connecting Ethan to her care. I had the email chain between Sophie and Nathan printed and notarized as a true copy. I had the trust amendment reviewed by an independent estate attorney, who confirmed in writing that its application would require a successful paternity challenge and that no such challenge could be initiated without proof. I had a second letter from a different estate attorney confirming that a paternity challenge filed in bad faith could constitute tortious interference with inheritance rights. I put all of it in a folder. The folder went into my bag. I went to my gender reveal party and I waited. When Sophie said those 4 words to my husband and I said I already know what's in that envelope, this is what I meant. I knew because I had been watching her for 6 months. I knew because I had done the work. And I knew that whatever she had put in that envelope, whatever fabricated or circumstantial document she had assembled to cast doubt, it would not survive contact with what I had in mine. Sophie stared at me. The room was quiet enough to hear the decorative tissue paper rustling near the window. Nathan was still holding her envelope, looking between us with an expression I can only describe as a man beginning to understand he had been standing in the middle of something much larger than he realized. I addressed the room. I said, I am sorry to do this here. I want you all to know that this is not how I wanted this afternoon to go. Then I looked at my mother-in-law Catherine, because she deserved to hear this from me directly, and I said, there are things that affect this family that need to be said. And I would rather say them now, than let them be said in a lawyer's office. I opened my folder on the kitchen island. I explained, methodically and without drama, what I had found. I did not perform outrage. I did not cry. I laid out the financial records connecting Ethan to Dana Whitfield's apartment. I presented Mia's information. I explained the trust amendment and who had the most to gain from it. I placed the email chain between Sophie and Nathan on the island last, so that it was the final thing everyone saw. Ethan said nothing throughout. He had the look of a man watching a controlled demolition, knowing it's coming, unable to stop it, unable to look away. Sophie said, you can't prove any connection between me and that clause. I said, you're right. I can't prove it in a courtroom today. But your husband can tell this room right now whether Dana Whitfield's daughter is his. And if she is, then everyone here can draw their own conclusions about why someone worked to plant a paternity challenge against mine. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It was Catherine who spoke first. She looked at Ethan and she said, simply and terribly, is it true? Ethan looked at the floor. His silence was the answer. Catherine sat down in the nearest chair. Robert stood very still, the way men of his generation sometimes stand when they are refusing to let their body show what their mind is processing. Sophie said, very quietly, when did you find out? And Ethan said, a year after she was born. Sophie's face did something complicated. Then she looked at me, and I want to tell you what her expression held in that moment, because it was not what I expected. It was not defiance. It was a kind of exhausted recognition, one woman seeing another woman who had been lied to, looking at a woman who had also been lied to, and the absurdity of the fact that they had been pointed at each other like weapons when they should have been looking in the same direction. I am not going to pretend Sophie and I became friends overnight. We did not. What happened that afternoon was messier and more human than a clean resolution. What happened was that she sat down at my kitchen table after most of the guests had quietly gathered their things and left. And she said to me, I knew about Mia 8 months ago. I found a receipt. I told myself if I could get the paternity question around your baby established, I would have leverage over Ethan, that he would have to stay, that he would have to keep our family intact, because the alternative was everything coming out. I looked at her for a long moment, and I said, you were trying to save your marriage by destroying mine. She said, yes. I said, that was a terrible plan. She said, I know that now. Nathan and I talked for most of that night, after everyone had gone. He showed me the email chain or tried to, and I told him I had already seen it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I should have told you. I said, yes, you should have. He said, I didn't believe it, but I also didn't push back on her. I didn't protect you the way I should have. That's something I have to sit with. I told him I agreed with that. I told him we would work through it, but that I needed him to understand that silence in the face of something like that was not neutrality. He understood. That conversation was not easy, and I am not going to tell you it resolved in a single night, because it didn't. What I will tell you is that we did the work. The weeks that followed were legally complicated in the way that all financial untangling tends to be. Robert hired the family's estate attorney, a different firm, carefully chosen to review the trust amendment, which was ultimately withdrawn on the grounds that it had been drafted without adequate disclosure to the principals. The attorney who had drafted it was the subject of a bar inquiry, which I understand is still ongoing. Robert and Catherine established a new trust provision that was straightforward and transparent, with accounts for Nathan and Ethan's children treated equally. Ethan moved out of the home he shared with Sophie in March. He has been making arrangements to be present in Mia's life openly, which is the right thing to do and also, I suspect, an enormous relief to Dana, who had been living with a partial truth for 3 years. Sophie filed for divorce. She and I have spoken twice since the party, once about the divorce proceedings and once, unexpectedly, over coffee in April. That second conversation was the one where she said something I have thought about many times since. I spent 4 years in that marriage trying to secure something that was never solid to begin with. I built my strategy on sand. And I said to her, I know. That's what deception does. It makes you think you're building, but you're just rearranging the sand. My daughter was born on a Thursday in May. Nathan was there. His parents were there. My mother held my hand on one side and Nathan held the other. We named her Iris, because in architecture there is a concept of the threshold, the point of transition between outside and inside, between what was and what will be, and the iris of the eye is the part that controls how much light gets in. We wanted her name to mean something about clarity. About choosing what you let through. 3 weeks after Iris was born, Sophie sent a gift to our house. It was a small silver frame with a card that said only, "She's beautiful." I'm sorry. I put the frame on Iris's dresser. Nathan asked if I was sure. I said yes. I am not interested in carrying the weight of someone else's worst moment for the rest of my life. Sophie made choices I would never have made. She also, in the end, made a different choice, and in my experience, the ability to choose differently when the truth becomes undeniable is the closest most people get to grace. Robert and Catherine came to see Iris on her first Sunday home. Robert sat in the chair by the window and held her for a long time without speaking. When he handed her back to Nathan, he said, "I should have looked more carefully at that amendment when it was filed. I should have asked more questions." I said, "Yes. You should have." And then, because he was a 71-year-old man holding back tears while looking at his granddaughter, "But she's here now. Build from here." That is the thing I keep returning to when I think about all of it. Every single person in that story, Ethan, Sophie, even Robert in his quiet way, made the same fundamental error. They all believed that the structure they wanted could be maintained by controlling information. By managing what other people knew. By deciding that partial truth was safer than whole truth. And every single one of them was wrong, because structures built on hidden loads always fail. The question is only when and how catastrophically. I built my response on transparency. On documented, verifiable, reproducible fact. On the understanding that if I was going to bring down what they had built, I had to be standing on solid ground when I did it. That is not a dramatic principle. It is an architectural one. Iris is 4 months old now. She has Nathan's eyes and my stubbornness, according to my mother, who says this as if it is a warning and a compliment at the same time. She does not know yet about the people who tried to define her before she arrived, and she will not know for a long time, and when she does know I will tell her the same thing I tell anyone who asks me how I stayed calm through all of it. I tell them, I had something worth protecting, and I had learned that the most durable protection is always the truth. Not the comfortable version of it. Not the version that keeps everyone in their seats. The whole version, documented and verified and brought into the light. The rest has a way of taking care of itself.